Jai Radha, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari,
Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari,
Gopi Jamaloba Giri Bharadari,
Gopi Jamaloba Giri Bharadari,
Yasodanandana Brajaja Ranjana,
Sodanandana Brajajana Ranjana,
Yamunatira Vanachari, Jai Radha Madhava Kunja Bihari, Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Hare Krishna, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Jai Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Prabhupada, Jai Om Vishnupada, Paramhamsa Parameditacharya, Do Tadasa Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada Ki, Ananda Koti Vaishnavrinda Ki, Brother Śrimad Bhāgavatam Ki, Samaveda Bhakta Vrinda Ki, Gold Prema. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to some devotees. All glories to Shri Shri Guru and Shri Om Brahma. So we are reading from Canto 3, Chapter 16, Text 20. So, yeah. Yam vai vibhuti upayatyanu manyar. Yam vai vibhuti upayatyanu anyar. Artharti visvasirasa dhurtapadarenu.
Artharti visvasirasa dhurtapadarenu.
Artharti visvasirasa dhurtapadarenu.
Artharti visvasirasa dhurtapadarenu.
Dhanyarpitam gritulasi navadama damno.
Dhanyarpitam gritulasi navadama dhamno.
Dhanyarpitam gritulasi tulasi navadama dhamno.
Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno.
Lokam madhuvratapatir iva kamayana.
Lokam madhuvratapateriva kamayana.
Lokam madhuvratapatir iva kamayana.
Lokam madhuvratapateriva kamayana.
Yam vai vibhutir upayatyanuvela manyai.
Yang vai vibhuti rupayata nuvela manye.
Artharti visvashira sa dhurta padarenu.
Arthati viso shirasadrita padarenu.
Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama damno.
Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno.
Lokam madhuvratapatir iva kamayana.
Lokam madhuvratapateriva kamayana. Yang vai vibhuti rupayati nuvela manye. Arthati visvasirasadrita padarenu. Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno. Lokam madhuvratapateriva kamayana. Yang vai vibhuti rupayata nuvela manye. Arthati visvasirasadrita padarenu. Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno. Lokam madhuvratapateriva kamayana. Yang vai vibhuti rupayata nuvela manye.
Yam vai vibhuti rupayatyanuvela manyai.
Arthati vishvasirasadrita padarenu.
Artharti visvasira sadhrita padarenu.
Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno.
Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno.
Lokam madhuvratapateriva kamayana.
Lokam madhuvratapatir iva kamayana. Vaishnava.
Yang vai vibhuti rupayate nuvela manye.
Artharti visvasira sadhrita padarenu. Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno. Lokam madhuvratapatir iva kamayana. Yam vai vibhuti rupayatyanuvela manyai. Artharti visvasira sadhrita padarenu. Dhanyarpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno. Lokam madhuvratapatir iva kamayana. Yam who? Vai, certainly. Vibhuti, Lakshmi, the goddess of fortune. Upayati, waits upon. Anuvelam, occasionally. Anyai, by others. Artha, material facility. Artibihi, by those who desire. Swashirasa, on their own heads. Drita, accepting. Pada, of the feet. Renu, the dust. Dhanya, by the devotees.
Arpita,
Arpita, offered. Angri, at your feet. Tulasi, of tulsi leaves. Nava, fresh. Dhamma, on the garland. Dhamnaha, having a place. Lokam, the place. Madhuvrata patehe, the king of the bees. Iva, like. Kamayana is anxious to secure. Okay, so the translation reads, the goddess of fortune Lakshmi, the dust of whose feet is worn on the head by others, waits upon you as appointed. For she is anxious to secure a place in the abode of the king of bees, who hovers on a fresh wreath of tulsi leaves offered at your feet by some blessed devotee. So we can do this responsibly. The goddess of fortune Lakshmi,
the goddess of fortune Lakshmi,
the dust of whose feet
is
worn on the head by others, waits upon you as appointed, for she is anxious to secure a place in the abode of the king of bees, who hovers on the fresh wreath of tulsi leaves, offered at your feet by some blessed devotee. So the purport is fairly short here by Srila Prabhupada. As previously described, Tulasi has attained all superior qualities due to being placed at the lotus feet of the Lord. The comparison made here is very nice. As the king of bees hovers over the Tulasi leaves offered to the lotus feet of the Lord, so Lakshmi, the goddess who is sought by the demigods, Brahmanas, Vaishnavas, and everyone else, always engages in rendering service to the lotus feet of the Lord. The conclusion is that no one can be the benefactor of the Lord. Everyone is actually the servant of the Lord. Yam vai vibhutir upayatyanu velamanya artharti bhisvashirasa rutapadarenu danyaharpitangri tulasi navadama dhamno lokam madhuratapater eva kamayana. The goddess of fortune Lakshmi, the dust of whose feet is worn on the head by others, waits upon you as appointed, for she is anxious to secure a place in the abode of the king of bees, who hovers on the fresh wreath of tulsi leaves offered at your feet by some blessed devotee. This is kind of a trend by devotees in general, that whatever exalted position a devotee might have, they always consider other devotees to be more exalted in some kind of way. This is, I think, in the book where it describes the devotee who goes through various places from...
Bhāgavatam.
What's that?
Bhāgavatam.
Yeah, Bhāgavatam, right. And so this devotee travels through different places, and wherever he asks the devotees, however exalted they are, they always say, oh, there's some other devotee that's more exalted than me. The area that we're in today here is in the section where the four Kumaras remain submissive. So originally, when The four Kumaras cursed giant Vijay. The Supreme Lord came to the scene, and then he replied to them, and he showed his love for the four Kumaras. As we see, I kind of think of this part as the four Kumaras missed the first part of the movie, so they didn't really kind of grasp what was going on. They're new to the scene of being devotees, so they don't understand the play between devotees of the Supreme Lord who have been devotees for a long time. So, but now they're kind of wising up to it very quickly. And so in this section, from 1 to 12, the Supreme Lord replies to the four Kumaras, and from 13 to 25 is where we are right now, and the four Kumaras remain submissive. And as we've discussed before, the four Kumaras expect that maybe they will also be punished in some kind of way, just as they punished the Jai and Vijay gatekeepers. They may also experience some kind of punishment. Then from 26 through 34, which is yet to come in this chapter, we're going to find out who is actually at fault. And this is described or discussed. And as we said the other day, that the four Kumaras feel that they were wrong in cursing Jai and Vijay. Jai and Vijay feel that they were wrong in blocking the four Kumaras. And the Supreme Lord feels that he's at fault because the gatekeepers are acting on his behalf. So everybody is, unlike in our world where most people shift the blame. It's kind of the most typical thing in human dealings, that whenever there's a problem, people shift the blame to someone else or something else. In this case, this is the opposite thing happening, where people are vying for accepting the blame. And in one case, there is no blame anywhere along in this situation, because the Supreme Lord wants to enjoy pastimes in the material world, and to do that, he needs to fight with somebody, and Jai and Vijay have volunteered for that, and this somewhat artificial situation has become created, and for this setup to get started, it has to be this way. So Jai and Vijay are being cursed. They'll go to the material world. There, they will meditate constantly on the Supreme Lord, but in an angry mood. So they will come into a competition with the Supreme Lord. All right. So Prabhupada here says that the conclusion is that no one can be the benefactor of the Lord. Actually, everyone is the servant of the Lord. So the Supreme Lord is the supreme, and he fulfills the desires of all the living entities, and everyone else is subordinate. So we can find out that Nityo Nityanam Chaitanas Chaitananam Eko Bahonam Yo Vididati Kaman, right? I think that's how the verse goes. That Nityo Nityanam, out of many eternals, Chaitanas Chaitananam, living entities, out of many living entities, Eko Bahonam, there is one who out of the many Yo Vididati Kaman gives them their material desires. There's only one living entity that can actually fulfill desires, not only for himself but for all the others, whereas the others merely have to stand and wait, hoping that their desires will be fulfilled. Of course, there are many living entities, particularly those in the material world, who do not know that all desires are only fulfilled by the Supreme Lord. But I thought that I would relate a kind of unusual situation here, where it says that no one can be a benefactor to the Lord. Actually, there's one story where there is indeed an individual who thought
himself a benefactor of the Supreme Lord. And that individual is none other than Garuda. So the story, of course, goes that Kasyap Muni had, as we've discussed earlier in previous sections of Śrimad Bhāgavatam, a number of wives, and two of them, Vinata and Kadru, many of them were sisters, but they had kind of a relationship going, Vinata and Kadru. And at one point, Kasyap offered that they could have a benediction. And Kadru, her benediction she wanted was that she would have thousands of children right away. And Vinata said that she would rather only have 2 children, but those 2 children would be very, very exalted children. So Kasyap Muni gave both their benedictions, and it came to pass then right away that Kadru is the mother of the snakes. So many, many thousands of snakes were generated, and Vinata saw her sister / co-wife enjoying with all of her thousands of snake children, and she became kind of a little disturbed after some time that she didn't have any children, you know. And both of them had children by laying eggs. So the little snake children came out right away, but the 2 eggs that Vinata gave were not hatching. And 500 years went by, and still there was no hatching of the eggs. So Vinata became a little perturbed, and she kind of cracked one of the eggs a little bit to see what was going on in there. And a child came out, and that child was Aruna. And we find out that this child will eventually become the chariot driver of the sun god. So this is Aruna, who comes out of the egg. And he says, "My dear mother, why did you prematurely open my eggs? I'm only half formed." So he had to undergo some difficulties because he wasn't quite fully developed at the time when she broke the egg, you know. So he said, "Therefore, I say that in the future you will also have to undergo difficulty because you will become the slave of your sister / co-wife, Kadru." So eventually Aruna took his place as the chariot driver of the sun god. And then some many years later, the other egg hatched, and the other egg, as we know, is Garuda. So when Aruna had made this sort of curse against his mother for having opened his egg early, the 2 sisters, Kadru and Vinata, Kadru came to Vinata and said, "My dear sister, there is a sacrificial horse that the, I think, demigods are going to use in a horse sacrifice. And I think that we can make a wager. How many hairs does this horse have on its tail? And how many are white and how many are black? We have not seen the horse. So you make a number and I'll make a number, and whoever's correct will be the owner of the other one. The other one will have to become the slave of the first one." So they made this wager, and they went there, and Kadru cheats. So she has her children, the snakes, go to the horse and attach itself to the tail, so they look like, hairs. And so she fudges the numbers, and so therefore she wins the bet, and therefore Vinata has to become the slave of Kadru. And when Garuda finally hatches, he is the king of the birds. So he is very powerful, so powerful that he is like a second Indra. Actually, there was some, I forget what the pastime is. I didn't get a chance to look that one up, but there was another pastime where Indra did something, and Kasyap Muni was obliged to create a second Indra. But Indra was very disturbed by that, so he came to Kasyap Muni, and Kasyap said, okay, well, we'll have another Indra, but it won't be a competitor of you. It'll be an Indra of the birds. And so that's Garuda. He's the Indra of the birds. So, any rate, Garuda was born, and the first thing that Garuda finds when he's born is that his mother tells him, now we are servants of the snakes and of Kadru, the various snakes. And so Kadru, being the mother of the snakes, had Garuda doing all these kind of really menial things. Like he was kind of like an airline for them. If they wanted to go somewhere, they would say, my dear Garuda, we want to go visit this planet. Please take us there. And they would all climb on Garuda, and Garuda would fly them to wherever they wanted to go. And so Garuda would fly here and there, and he was really annoyed with this duty of having to ferry these snakes around everywhere. So kind of to get back at them, at one time he was carrying them. He flew really near to the sun just so that they would kind of get burned and scorched a little bit by being at the sun. And so they were crying out, and their mother, Kadru, heard that. So she approached Indra and said, my dear Indra, can you cause some rain to save my children from being cooked alive on the back of Garuda? And so there was some rain, and the snakes survived. And after that episode, then Garuda came to Kadru and said directly, my dear co-mother, is there something I can do, or some feat that I can perform, or some knowledge I can get, so that we can be done with this thing where my mother has to be servant of you and of your children? And so Kadru thinks about it for a minute, and she says, yeah, actually, we've heard that the demigods have this nectar of immortality, and we would like to get that so that we can drink it and we can become immortal. Of course, this is a big thing in the demigod world. In the material world, everybody's after money, but in the demigod world, people are after this nectar of immortality. So Garuda says, all right, done. So he decides he's going to get the nectar from the heavenly planets. The demigods hear about this. Indra hears about this, and they think, uh-oh, someone's going to come and try to steal the nectar. So they rig up some safety devices. They have a special place where you can't find the nectar, and it's guarded by serpents with eyes that just look at you and you die immediately. And there's this big chakra wheel around there that would slice anyone that came anywhere close into mincemeat. And so the demigods are saying, well, I think that this is going to work now. We'll be able to protect this from Garuda or whoever tries to steal the nectar. So Garuda goes there, and he hits the turning wheel with his wing, and immediately it crumbles, and then he kills the snakes. On the way there, though, he gets hungry, so it takes him a while to actually get to where the nectar is, because he has to figure out what he can eat, and so he's not a vegetarian, by the way, Garuda, for whatever reason. I don't know. That's something that isn't exactly explained, but at one point he's eating the nishadas, and then later on he eats this tortoise, and this giant tortoise and elephant who've been fighting for thousands of years, and then he fights with the demigods, and he fights with these snakes, and he gets the nectar, and he carries it away. So now Garuda is returning to Kadru and the snake children with the nectar that he's taken from the demigods, and demigods are really disturbed by this. Particularly Indra is disturbed. So Indra comes to Garuda, and he says, "My dear Garuda, can't we be friends somehow or another? Is there some way I could get you to voluntarily return the nectar to the demigods?" And Garuda says, "Well, I don't want the nectar for myself. I gave it just so that we be released from this curse. So essentially, I've done my bit. I've given it to the snakes. If you really want it, then you figure out some way to get it back. I won't fight you for it. I don't want the nectar." So Indra hatches a plan. He says, "Well, you tell the snakes that they have to take ablutions and be washed before they drink the nectar." So they put the nectar on some darba grass, and there's a big yajna happening for the snakes before they can drink the nectar. This is reminiscent of the whole thing where the demigods and the demons, are trying to vie for the nectar. So in this case, it's the snakes that are going to get the imperishable nectar of immortality. So the nectar is there, and as the snakes go to wash themselves, Indra comes and just takes the pot away, and it's gone. When the snakes come back, they realize they were gypped. That the nectar is gone, but there's a little bit left on the darba grass. So they start licking the darba grass to try to get some little bit of the nectar of immortality. And because Indra made some kind of a spell or something like that, their tongues split in two, and that's why snakes have forked tongues, but I guess they got some aspect of nectar, but not the full deal or something like that. And so Garuda and his mother are freed from the curse, and it's this point where Garuda meets Vishnu, and Vishnu is very amazed at what's happened, that this Garuda has done all these things. And so Garuda doesn't exactly know who Vishnu is. And so Vishnu says, "My dear Garuda, so you have done all these amazing deeds. Please take a benediction from me." And so the benediction that Garuda wants from Vishnu is that he says, "I've read some Puranas. I would like to speak a Purana." And so Garuda is given the benediction by Vishnu to speak, you guessed it, the Garuda Purana. So, and then Garuda says, "And my dear Vishnu, now you can take a benediction from me." And Vishnu says, "Well, actually, the benediction I would like from you is that you are always under me." So this is how Vishnu accepted Garuda as his carrier. And also, I think, implicit in this is Vishnu is explaining to Garuda that he is always beneath Vishnu. So, at any rate, this is showing that indeed sometimes this kind of unusual interplay can happen. So, there is no one like the Supreme Lord. He is in a singular category all by himself, and everyone is his servant. Everyone is, subordinate to him. It's interesting in this particular verse here, it does not quote the Chaitanya Charitamrita, whereas in the other database that I read, it did. That there is a verse, of course, that verse about I'm not a Brahmana, I'm not a Vaishya, I'm not a Shudra, I am servant of the servant of the servant. So that's the supreme realization of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, you know. Naham vipro narapatir. I forget what the whole verse is, but it describes that everyone is just simply a servant, actually a servant of the servant, you know, that we are not even servants of the Supreme, we are servants of the servants of the Supreme, which is kind of hard for most of us to take, at least, you know. In the material world, everybody wants to be the manager or the master or the superior. And to enter a realm where everybody considers themselves subordinate, or as I was mentioning in the very beginning, everybody else thinks of themselves as some minor player and everybody else is doing some wonderful thing, is kind of the thing that really twists the arm of the false ego in the wrong way, you know. So this is really hard for the consciousness to accept. We are so used to wanting to be the big chief, you know, the big ape on Monkey Island, as they say, you know. We want to be the center of things. That's essentially why we left the spiritual world and came here to begin with. So naturally, that mentality is the last to go. But if you're introspective, you can see that mentality working in your attitude, in your activities and things, and you can try to root it out. There was some really amazing statement that Bhaktisiddhanta said that seeing if I can remember it, I won't do it justice, but that let the censorious materialists calumniate against us to their full desire. We will not mind them. Let us rather roll in the ecstasy of the tasty wine of being it starts out actually with there is no, I forget how he says it. I'll have to look that saying up, because it's really kind of poetic and it really sums up everything. He's saying that we do not find love in the material world. Only the devotees give us an indication of love. So yeah. Okay. Yeah. We do not find God in this. Whoops, I touched it wrong and now it's gone. I must have really seriously moved it. Okay. We do not find God in this world. The devotees who serve God out of their mercy show themselves to us. We should follow their conduct and teaching. It is the only path to our well-being. Due to our meager education and small experience, to most of us, the ideas and ways of thinking of the devotees of God appear to be unedifying slave mentality. Let us not indulge in such profane ravings under the urge of mental aberration. On the contrary, our line of thought should be, let the censorious people calumniate us to their heart's content. We will not mind them. Let us roll in the dust and forget everything in the ecstasy of intoxication by excessive drinking of the strong and tasty wine of love of Lord Hari. That's Bhaktisiddhanta's way of describing the situation. So we are trying to become slaves of the Supreme Lord. But what's interesting is the Supreme Lord is kind of becoming our slave as well. That's what generally people don't focus in on. People are against religion, or they're against devotion, or they're against any kind of talk of the Supreme Lord. because they think of the Supreme Lord as the supreme egoist. And they think, he's taking away all independence. But actually, the Supreme Lord is creating a web of very intimate relationships. And that's what it means to be connected with the Supreme Lord, being part of a very intimate relationship. And in so doing, we want to please him, not because we have to or we fear the Supreme Lord, but because we genuinely want to please him, because we understand who he really is and why we should try to please him. And then, strangely enough, the Supreme Lord reciprocates, and he wants to please the devotees, because if someone gives themselves fully to the Supreme Lord turns around and gives himself fully to that devotee. All right, so questions, comments? Let the mic, that way our YouTube friends can also play along at home.
Hare Krishna. Thank you for a nice class. Is this story of Garuda and Aruna, is that in Bhāgavatam, or where is that story?
No, it's in, I forget, I saw it actually it's in the Mahabharata. It's in the, what's called the Puranic Encyclopedia. That's where I looked at a kind of an overview version of it. But I remember originally coming across the story when Hridayananda Swami was doing his translation of the Mahabharata. And before it ever appeared in a written form, it was on a whole tape series. And I remember listening to that tape series. It was quite ecstatic, actually. There was lots of stories in there and lots of things that you generally didn't hear. And this story was there. I think I still have those tapes somewhere, in my collection of, stuff that actually we need to get rid of. But I think that it's now been released as a literary version, I think, some way or another. But I may be wrong there. I thought that at this point it's actually available. Yeah.
Hare Krishna. So this being a servant of the servant, when I hear about this, there are two different ways of seeing this. One is that I am lower, focusing on a kind of a self-deprecation, that I don't want to take a prominent position, I want to take a lower position. I don't want to be at the forefront. The other mood I sometimes see is that I want to be a servant of the servant because it is a more sweeter position. There is more nectar in serving the devotees than by serving the servant of the devotee, because I can access the glories a lot more easily through that. So when I see this, when devotees are speaking like this, when they say about Lakshmi and such, what are the devotees feeling? Are they feeling more of this sense of how I want to take a more lower position, or is it more of a more lower position, or is it more of they are motivated by it because it is so much better? It's a better position.
Better position, a better person?
Better position because it's more sweeter.
Well, I think in general, the devotees may have various different motivations depending on their own mentality. But anyone who studies the philosophy of Krishna consciousness long enough comes to the obvious and undeniable solid conclusion that the Supreme Lord is in a category by himself, and that the only reasonable thing to do is to try to forge a relationship with him through service. That's the only reasonable thing to do. And then we discover that we feel a disinclination to do that, and that disinclination is rooted in our original emigration from the spiritual world, when we decided that why does the Supreme Lord always have to be the center of things? Can't we be the center? So the material world is specifically designed so that we can imagine that we are the center of things, even though it's factually not possible. It's possible because we only imagine that we're at the center. We are not, but we just imagine that we are. And when we come out of illusion, then we come out of the false idea that we really are at the center. We become aware that we are not, that we only thought we were. And so what's the use of, reality is always better than however wonderfully pompous a dream or an illusion we might hold on to. And we more or less become once again accustomed to and used to the idea that this is the way it is. It's not going to change at some time in the future. And then we work on the idea of continuing activity and devotional service, which gradually purifies us of this somehow false ego need to be the center of things, which is everywhere in the material world. Everywhere in the material world there's this one-upsmanship, as they call it, the drive to be the top of the corporate ladder, to be the center of the party, to be the most famous and well-known of celebrities, to be the wealthiest of all various kinds of, magnates. So these things are everywhere shot through in the material world. There's this constant, jostling for position, like jockeys in a horse race, and it's a game we can't win, and it's a frustrating game, and it's a game that even if you do win for a short time, it's lonely at the top, and it's not at all what people think it is. Actually, people who are, very famous, very wealthy, very powerful, such people find that their lives are very hollow because, in fact, the more you think you are, the more ridiculous the situation becomes. Most people are forced by circumstance to realize that they're nothings, they have to ride the subway and try to scrape together enough money to pay the next mortgage or rent or whatever it is, So most of us are forced by material nature to kind of give up that mentality. But those few people who can actually make that idea at least vaguely realizable in their own minds by their surroundings, they become very depressed in general because it's lonely being the most famous. It's lonely being the most wealthy or the most intelligent or whatever it is. You have fewer and fewer people you can relate to, and there's a lot of negativity associated with being in that position. And of course, it's false. So there's a hollowness to it. And this is kind of what devotional service is the rehabilitation from. I think of Krishna consciousness kind of being like a rehab, where we, instead of rehabilitating from some drug, habit, we're rehabbing from the tendency to want to be the big ape on Monkey Island, to be the king of the whole scene to be the life of every party, to be the center of it all. Yeah. Any other questions or comments? All right, so we are at 9 right now, so thank you all very much for your kind attention. All glories to Śrimad Bhāgavatam. All glories to the Vaishnava devotees of the Lord. Hare Krishna.